Well, hello again, everyone. Your bad grandpa back with you, Charlie Michaels. Here to give you some more grief if you're a greasy gracer. And you deserve some more grief if you are a greasy gracer. And you're going to get some here if your demons can stay long enough with me to hear it, which I kind of doubt it. Oh, by the way, those of you who I tagged, yeah, you either are a greasy gracer or you recently made a comment on a Greasy Grace channel, which blocked me in self-defense. And since I can't comment there, I brought you to my channel. Now, you don't have to stay, of course, but come Judgment Day, don't try playing the ignorance card, ain't gonna work. Speaking of Judgment Day, as the thumbnail says, a lot of people think Romans chapter 4, verse 2 is their get out of hell free card. And what does it say? For if Abraham were justified by works, he has whereof to glory, but not before God. If Abraham were justified by works, he has whereof to glory, something to brag about, but not before God. And you read that and you wonder, well, why not? I mean, if he's justified by what he did, the good things he did, why shouldn't he be proud of it? Even before God, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that verse is not talking about anything Abraham did. Yeah, that's right. It's not talking about what Abraham personally did. The works in that verse is the same works that Paul was talking about in Romans chapter 3, verse 21, and just 5 verses above in Romans 3 and verse 28. And Paul doesn't describe the type of works that he's talking about in Romans 4:2 because he just did 4 verses above. You know, if I'm talking about NBA basketball, and I've been talking about NBA basketball, and I choose to use the word basketball, you're not thinking that I'm talking about, you know, my little pickup group in the neighborhood. No, you're thinking I'm talking about NBA basketball because I just mentioned the NBA in my last few sentences. Well, Paul has been talking about works of the law of Moses, of which he was an expert. All of chapter 3, he's talking about the contrast between the works of the law and something else that justifies now, which is faith. Faith meaning fidelity, okay? So again, look at this verse. For if Abraham were justified by works, he has whereof to glory, but not before God. He has something to brag about, but not before God. Again, why not? Well, that verse, again, is not talking about things that Abraham personally did. We know that because we don't see a personal pronoun like his. For if Abraham was justified by his works, his is not there. His is in Romans 2:7, Romans 2:6. Romans 2:6, for he shall give everyone according to his works. Paul is talking about Judgment Day. God will render everyone according to his works. He's quoting the psalmist, 62:12. But we don't see his in Romans 4:2 because it's not talking about anything Abraham did. It's talking about the same works of the law that atone for sin. You look in the Old Testament, you look up terms like sin offering, guilt offering, peace offering. These are specific deeds that atone for sin. And that was in the law of Moses, which Paul has just been talking about in Romans chapter 3. And just above in 3:28. So in 4:2, 4 verses below that, he's not talking about taking little old ladies across the street. No. He's still talking about the works of the law. And again, we don't see Paul talking about good works. In Romans 13:3, he tells you what type of works he's talking about when he uses the term good. He uses the koine adjective, agatha. Good, it's translated. Good works are not a terror to the authorities, Romans 13:3. So, in 4:2, Paul is not talking about good deeds. No. He's talking about works of the law that justify. And the reason why Abraham can't glory before God is because he didn't have the law of Moses. He didn't have a priesthood to perform the works for him like they're supposed to. It's supposed to be an Aaronic priest, Numbers 18:7. They didn't have a temple to perform these works. You can't just do the sacrifices anywhere. It's got to be a consecrated temple, specific one. Look at Deuteronomy 12, verse 5 and forward. It's got to be a specific place to do these works that atone for sin with a specific priest. And so when it says, if Abraham were justified by works, he had something to glory about, but not before God, because God never gave him those works to do. He never gave him any priest or any temple. So that verse is not talking about Paul is not talking about Abraham's personal actions. No, he's still talking about works of the law. Abraham is not justified by works because there are no works to justify him. They're not available yet. That's 500-600 years down the road. And that's why he's using Abraham. Because above, he was contrasting obedience to the Torah, which required performing works that atone for sin. And he's contrasting that with obedience to God, which now requires obedience to his son, the Messiah. But Abraham, he was made just by his entrusting to God, by his obeying God. We read that in Genesis 26:5. He followed all the laws of God, all the ordinances. He did everything God told him to do. He didn't always believe everything he said. Abraham, if he did, there wouldn't have been an Ishmael. If he did, he wouldn't have tried to pass his wife off as his sister because he thought he was going to die if he didn't. Okay, so Abraham didn't always believe, but he always obeyed. That's what the story of Abraham shows, and that's why Paul brings him in chapter 4 to show how you could be right with God without the Old Testament law. Abraham is a perfect example of someone who was righteous with God because he did what God told him to do. That's the faith. It's not Abraham's ability to suspend disbelief about supernatural activities. No. Abraham's faith was his willingness to entrust his future to God, and that's exactly what he did. And that's why he was deemed righteous. Not because of his credulity, but because of his allegiance, his fidelity. And that's what will justify us in the end. And that's what Paul was trying to say. We are justified the same way Abraham was, through our obedience, through our faithfulness to God. Now, I know a lot of you greasy gracers don't want to hear that. Sorry, that's what the scriptures say. And you don't get to eisegete his into Romans 4:2. You don't get to eisegete good into Romans 4:2. Good isn't there, and his isn't there. Romans 4:2 is about the works of the law being discussed in 3:21 and 3:28. So sorry, it's not about what Abraham personally did. Works are works of the Torah that atone for sin. And they're all over the Old Testament. Look up sin offering. Look up guilt offering. That's what Paul is talking about with that term, works. Okay? Now, I don't think many of the greasy gracers I tagged are still with me. But to those of you who did get something out of this, thanks for visiting. I'll try and keep them short and sweet like this for a while. We'll see what happens. God bless. Your bad grandpa is out.